If you think clippers just chop the top off or limiters just squash the top down, you're not wrong. But it's more complicated than that, especially if you're striving to get loud and clean masters. Take a listen to these 3 snippets and let me know in the comments which one you think is which and which sounds the best.
Easy to say it was mutual, but don't think it was in my mind. Easy to say it was mutual, but don't think it was in my mind. Easy to say it was mutual, but don't think it was in my mind.
So let me know in the comments, and we're going to get to these 3 snippets later on in the video to actually discover what's going on. But first, what is the real difference between clippers and limiters? Digital clippers work using mathematical functions. For each sample, the clipper looks at its assigned amplitude value. If it's greater than the threshold value, it will reassign the value of that sample to the threshold value. And if it's less than the negative threshold value, it will reassign the value of that sample to the negative threshold value. Otherwise, it will just leave the samples untouched. For soft clippers, each sample value is modified by a mathematical function like cubic polynomials or trigonomic functions like arctangents. In Venn Audio's free clip, it literally lists the mathematical function it uses to do this. So you've got hard clipping, quintic formula, you've got cubic, hyperbolic tan, algebraic, and we're going to look at arctangent. What happens is each sample the plugin looks at and it goes into a for loop, applying this trigonomic function to its amplitude value. Now, to level this up, plugins like Standard Clip offer you a scaling factor, so you can actually control how much of that arctangent is actually processing each of those samples, or how far away those samples are actually being changed in value or soft clipped towards the ceiling. So as I bring this down, you'll see that start to become more of a sine wave, and as I bring it up, it starts to open it back up to a full arctangent function. Now, the result of changing these sample values are harmonics, based on how much the sample values have changed. The greater the change in the sample values over longer sequences of samples, the more you can hear it. And this is why clippers are usually used to great effect on things like transient information, because the short burst of samples over the threshold in a very short transient is almost impossible to hear. Those harmonics are almost too quick for the ear to pick up on. Now, that's the whole clippers chop the top off function explained in as detailed terms as I can. For limiters, instead of mathematical functions, they use gain reduction circuits. Those gain reduction circuits receive a sidechain signal, which is usually just the signal itself. And when that signal exceeds the threshold in that gain reduction circuit, the amplitude of the passing signal is reduced. And it's reduced at a ratio of infinity to 1. So it's literally flatlines it. Now, if your release moves faster than the sample rate, you effectively have a hard clipper. It's basically that for if else loop where if it's above the threshold, it just stays at 0. If it's below, it stays at 0. And if it's moving faster than the sample rate, that release time, you've got a hard clip. But that's not always desirable. And if you're using a limiter that fast, use a hard clipper. But what is good about limiters is the ability to dial in time-bound parameters. And it's what makes limiters a powerful tool, because you can manipulate the release time for a more musical response and ones that don't introduce as many harmonics as clipping does. And it also allows the gain reduction to ebb and flow and move with the music. So what I've got here is this session, and I'm going to go over into Audio Editor. This is the mix we're looking at, and I just thought of this mix off the top of my head to use for it, and I actually didn't realize how perfect it was for a clipper limiter demonstration, because I thought this didn't have much transient information at all, and actually had lots of transient and lots of sustained information, which makes it the perfect example to showcase the use of clippers and limiters together in best case scenarios. Now, when you look at something like this, these really sharp transients, if we just use a limiter, what's going to end up happening is if you look at limiter only, so if you look here, you've got these transients which come up, and if I go into limiter only, I've got a version where I've just applied limiting to it. We can look at the transients, and we're going to listen to this. It ducks, and you can see the release there. Every time it hits, it has this sort of like scoop to it, okay? What we actually want to do is those sharp transients we want to clip. Now, if we clip off all of those transients, it's going to be pretty noticeable, because if we go to chop off 4 decibels of transient, you're going to get a lot of crackling. And that's probably what you might have heard in the first demonstration I showed you. That first file I was playing was just hard clipping -4 decibels. And why we do this is to buy headroom but this just crackles when you're actually hard clipping 4 decibels of transient information.
Easy to say it was mutual, but don't think it was in my mind. I wish you were.
That's not good. So instead what we're going to do is we're going to use the hard clipper at 2 decibels. So anything that's below that 2 decibel ceiling, we're going to cut off with hard clipping. And if we go to our loudest peak at 0.18, that's our loudest peak, you can see how many samples this is going to pull. I'm going to just move over to this loudest peak. So at -2 decibels, we're clipping at any instance 3 or 4 samples. Now, 3 or 4 samples, I've said this example before on the channel, over 48,000 samples a second. That's almost instantaneous. You're not going to hear the distortions this introduces. And just to showcase that, let's actually set that up here on this channel here. We're going to enter standard clip, and we're going to set the limiter at -2 decibels. And we'll actually go over to that time marker. Where is it? 41 seconds.
Can't be held back when now I'm.
Okay, listen to that.
'Cause I can't be held back when now I'm.
We'll actually play it at its loudest peak, where the clipper's doing the most amount of clipping to the sample, or the biggest change in value.
'Cause I can't be held back when now I'm finally doing me. 'Cause I can't be held.
So if I just loop that click there and turn the clipper on and off.
Can't be, I 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 can't.
Very, almost indistinguishable, okay, that clipping.
Can't be, I can't be, I can't be, I can't be.
Almost indistinguishable, that clipping, and that's important. So that's the first stage I would address this. I'd use hard clipping for those very short, 4 or 5 samples that just go over. And here's the hard clip version of what we just did. But I want to be able to buy myself a little bit more headroom. These peaks are going to still chew up quite a bit if we're trying to drive loudness. We know that we can't do hard clipping on this. So what we're going to do is we're going to use Soft Clip Pro and slowly push up into there. Now, how we're going to judge that is we're going to go into here and we're going to meter -4 decibels, okay? And by metering here, we can look and see, maybe not -4, that looks a little bit aggressive because we're getting some of the body. We don't want to be clipping the sustained portion of the signal, those big parts of the body. Let's actually go to the loudest section. It's probably a bit too hard. Let's just pull it back a little bit. -3. Okay, so to get -3 soft clipping from here, we want to be at 2.5. And that's going to allow the arctangent curve to start at -3 into that ceiling of 2. So let's have another listen to this and see how we're coming along.
I wish you were. Nothing felt like it was changing, but nothing felt.
That is the clipping portion. That's all the transient information. Now, if we want to push it louder than this, or we want to keep driving it without getting that distortion, what we're going to look at using is the limiter. Now, this limiter I've set up here is -4 decibels, which is that whole amount of headroom that we wanted to manage in the first place, but just on a limiter. And what you're going to see and hear is that whenever that kick comes in, it ducks. It will not distort. It won't distort. It'll just duck and pump. So take a listen to this.
Easy to say it was mutual, but don't think it was in my mind. Say.
So you can hear that bass. Every time the kick comes in, the bass just, it's like it's got a side chain like compressor on it because that limiter is releasing back up. So we can't do that much limiting all on its own. What we actually need to do is add a limiter here, okay? Going to add a limiter, L1, and I'm using L1 just because it's bare bones simple. We're not getting into the fancy frills of different kinds of clipper functions and etc. I just want to understand the ballistics of it, or I want you guys to understand the ballistics of it. So hard clipping, really good for super short transients and why, the mathematical function, and soft clipping, really good for leaning into those transients because you control with the scaling factor. I think the soft tube clipper has this as well, and a few other plugins have this scaling factor for that mathematical function to allow you to soft clip into the ceiling really nicely. Now the limiter here, we're going to set to -4 because we're coming out of this standard clip at -2. I reckon we can afford to be at -4. We'll set the ceiling to -2 and let's just see how much pumping we get. If it's too much, we might have to dial that threshold back.
Easy to say it was mutual, but don't think it.
A little bit much. Let's go -3.
Go on. Easy to say it was mutual, but don't think it was in my mind.
Now let's listen to hard clipping only, limiting only, and then the combination of hard, soft clipping and limiting gently used in conjunction with one another. So with the hard clipping we'll listen to first, you're going to hear just those little crackles at the top.
Easy to say it was mutual, but don't think it was in my mind.
Okay, you heard that little bit of crackling just at the top. Now the limiting, you're just going to hear the pumping of it jumping back up on itself.
Easy to say it was mutual, but don't think it was in my mind.
You know, you hear that just pumping up, and we don't want that effect. We want it to be nice and consistent and clean. And this version here, what we have is we've got the hard clipping at -2, the soft clipper up into the ceiling. It's only 1 decibel of arc tangent moving in because we've scaled it by 0.4%. And then we've got the limiter at the end. So you've got the hard clipping, a little bit of soft clipping, a little bit of limiting all together.
Easy to say it was mutual, but don't think it was in my mind.
So the reason why I wanted to present this to you is because clipping is just more complicated than saying it chops the top off. And limiters are more complicated than saying it just ducks the top down. They have different functions. One runs off mathematical functions where it alters the sample values one by one, and that has a very profound effect on the sound. And understanding how hard clippers and soft clippers work is really powerful to helping you get louder masters. And the same with limiters. They're not looking at the sample values like a clipper are. They're using gain reduction circuits like a compressor does, and they've got ballistics to the time domain parameters so they can move a little bit more smoothly around sustained passages. Anyway, I hope that helps you out, and until next time, take care.